The sweltering heat of a Chicago summer morning shimmered off the concrete tarmac at Onare International Airport. The rhythmic beeping of boarding announcements, the jumbled conversations of travelers, and the hum of engines created a steady background symphony as people hurried through the terminals. For many, SkyWest Flight 728 was just another routine journey, an early morning escape to the heart of New York City, before heading on to more thrilling adventures. Some were off to business meetings, while others, like the Johnson family, were on their way to a summer getaway in the Catskills. But for 13-year-old Jamal Green, this trip was a lifeline. His slender frame leaned against the terminal window, his dark brown eyes lost in contemplation as he watched plane after plane take off from the runway. A small smile tugged at the corners of his lips each time an aircraft lifted into the sky, vanishing into the horizon like an unattainable dream. He had always aspired to be up there in control, guiding one of those magnificent machines through the clouds. Jamal wasn't like most kids his age. While others chatted about sports or video games, he spent his free time engrossed in aviation manuals, his mind always in the skies. Beside him, Danielle Green, his mother, sipped from a cup of black coffee. Her eyes reflected the quiet exhaustion of a single mother who had been working double shifts as a nurse for months just to gather enough funds for this trip. It was intended as a gift, a much-needed break from the relentless grind of life in Chicago's South Side, and a chance to heal from the loss of Jamal's father, who had passed away the previous year. She glanced at Jamal, her heart heavy with unspoken sorrow, and smiled. "Are you excited, sweetheart?" she asked gently, her voice warm but tinged with fatigue. Jamal nodded, though he remained fixated on the planes outside. His mother's attempts at conversation went unnoticed, but she didn't mind. She understood him well enough to know that the enthusiasm was there, just hidden beneath his quiet exterior. Boarding Flight 728 to New York LaGuardia. "All passengers please proceed to Gate 32, came the voice over the loudspeaker, breaking the silence. Danielle nudged her son, pulling him out of his trance. "Come on, Jamal, time to go." Jamal grabbed his well-worn leather backpack, slinging it over his shoulder as he stood. Inside were a few books on aircraft mechanics, a tablet loaded with flight simulator apps, and a notebook filled with his sketches of planes. His passion for aviation wasn't merely a hobby, it was an obsession. Ever since he was a little boy, he dreamed of becoming a pilot, of soaring above the clouds, away from the troubles of life on the ground. They walked toward the gate, weaving through the crowd of fellow travelers. Jamal's eyes remained locked on the Boeing 737 that awaited them on the tarmac, its sleek blue and white fuselage gleaming in the morning sun. His heart raced with anticipation, though he kept his excitement contained behind a calm demeanor. For Jamal, this wasn't just a plane. It was a marvel of engineering, a symbol of freedom. As they boarded, greeted by the smiling flight attendants, Jamal made a beeline for his window seat in row 18. He pressed his face against the cold glass, watching the ground crew prepare for takeoff. His mother settled into the seat beside him with a sigh, sinking into the cushion with visible relief. "Are you sure you don't want the aisle seat? It might be more comfortable for your legs," she offered. "No, I'm good," he mumbled, eyes glued to the activity outside. The engines roared to life, the deep hum vibrating through the cabin, and Jamal's heart skipped a beat in excitement. He loved everything about planes, the power, the precision, the feeling of escape. As the plane taxied to the runway, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Travis Franklin, and I'd like to welcome you aboard SkyWest Flight 728 with non-stop service to New York's LaGuardia Airport. We'll be cruising at an altitude of 35,000 feet with an estimated flight time of just over 2 hours. Weather looks clear for most of the route, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." Jamal barely heard the announcement. His mind was already in the cockpit, imagining himself behind the controls, adjusting the flaps and throttles, guiding the plane through the endless sky. As the aircraft began its ascent, Jamal's pulse quickened. The ground fell away beneath them, Chicago shrinking into the distance, replaced by the vast expanse of clouds and blue sky. For the first hour, the flight was uneventful. The passengers around them settled into their routines, some flipping through magazines, others dozing off. The faint sound of a baby crying from the back of the plane occasionally interrupted the calm, but most travelers seemed content to enjoy the quiet. Jamal, however, never took his eyes off the horizon. The world outside the window fascinated him, the steady hum of the engines like music in his ears. But then, Just as the flight attendants were finishing their drink service, the plane shuddered. Just a slight jolt, but enough to make everyone glance up in concern. The fasten seatbelt sign blinked on, and the passengers exchanged nervous glances. Jamal felt a twinge of unease. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, but this time there was an edge to his tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Danielle looked at Jamal, trying to smile, but he could see the worry in her eyes. "It's okay, sweetheart, just a little bump." But Jamal knew something was amiss. The turbulence was one thing, but the captain's voice, it was too tense. He had heard enough flight announcements on his simulator to recognize when a pilot wasn't telling the full truth. Suddenly, the plane lurched violently to one side. The calm was shattered by gasps and cries as the aircraft dipped, sending drink carts and unsecured bags tumbling into the aisles. Jamal's heart raced as he gripped the armrests. Overhead compartments burst open, showering the floor with luggage. His ears popped painfully as the plane began a rapid descent. The ocean below rushed up to meet them as passengers screamed, their panic spreading like wildfire. Jamal's vision blurred as the G-forces pressed him back into his seat, his stomach lurching with every drop. For a brief moment, it felt like the plane was plummeting out of control, heading straight for the water. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the plane leveled out with a jarring thud. Passengers were thrown forward in their seats, cries of fear filling the cabin as oxygen masks deployed from the ceiling. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. Something had gone terribly wrong in the cockpit. He glanced at his mother, who was clutching the armrest with white knuckles, her face pale. Jamal knew what he had to do. "I'm going up there," he said, his voice shaking with determination. "No, Jamal." Danielle grabbed his arm, her voice trembling with fear. "Stay in your seat." But Jamal was already unbuckling his seatbelt. Before his mother could stop him, he scrambled into the aisle, his heart hammering in his chest. He had to get to the cockpit. Jamal's legs carried him down the aisle before his mind could catch up. He could hear his mother's frantic voice behind him, but his focus was fixed on the cockpit door ahead. The plane rocked with another jolt, causing passengers to clutch their armrests and overhead bins to rattle. But Jamal didn't stop. His instincts told him something was deeply wrong. When he reached the cockpit door, it was locked. His heart sank, but he didn't hesitate. He banged on the door with both fists, shouting over the chaos, "Open up! Open the door!" His voice was drowned out by the sounds of panicked passengers, and the plane's strained groan as it fought against the forces pulling it downward. A flight attendant, pale and trembling, appeared from the galley, her eyes wide with fear, and for a moment she seemed frozen in place, unsure of what to do. "You need to go back to your seat," she yelled over the din, trying to maintain some semblance of control, but her voice wavered. She was as terrified as everyone else. "The pilots! Something's wrong with the pilots!" Jamal shouted back, his voice breaking with urgency. The fear in his chest threatened to overwhelm him, but he pushed it down. He couldn't afford to be scared, not now. The flight attendant hesitated, her eyes flicking between Jamal and the cockpit door. She knew what he was saying could be true. The turbulence, the lack of communication from the pilots, it all pointed to something being very, very wrong. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the emergency access code panel beside the door. With shaking hands, she punched in the code. There was a soft hiss as the door unlocked, swinging open with a creak. Jamal's stomach turned as he stepped into the cockpit. The scene inside was worse than he had imagined. Both the captain and the co-pilot were slumped over in their seats, their bodies limp and unresponsive. The control panels in front of them were alive with flashing red lights and alarms, the aircraft systems screaming for attention. The autopilot was still engaged, but the plane was losing altitude rapidly, the altimeter ticking down by hundreds of feet every minute. The flight attendant let out a choked gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the blaring alarms. She stumbled back, her face pale with shock. Jamal's heart pounded in his ears as he took in the chaotic scene. He could feel the panic clawing at the edges of his mind, threatening to take over. He was just a kid who loved planes, yes, but this was far beyond anything he had ever imagined. How could he possibly help? But then, through the haze of fear, he remembered all the hours he had spent in front of his flight simulator. He recalled the nights he stayed up reading aviation manuals, memorizing every detail of a Boeing 737's controls. His father had always told him that one day he'd fly planes for real. Jamal had never thought it would happen like this. He took a deep breath, forcing his hands to stop trembling as he stepped closer to the pilot's seat. The flight attendant seemed paralyzed by fear, but Jamal's focus was razor-sharp now. Without wasting a second, the flight attendant grabbed the radio headset from the captain's seat. Her hands shook as she pressed the button to speak. "This is Sky West Flight 728. We have an emergency. Both pilots are unconscious, and there's no one flying the plane." Her voice cracked as she spoke, panic seeping through the radio. After what felt like an eternity, a calm, authoritative voice filled the cockpit. "Sky West 728, this is New York Air Traffic Control. We are aware of your situation. Can anyone on board operate the aircraft?" Jamal didn't hesitate. I can help," he said, his voice trembling slightly. The flight attendant turned to him, her eyes wide with disbelief, but Jamal stood his ground. "I know about planes. I know how they work. I've trained. Kind of. I've done it in simulators." The silence that followed his words felt like a lifetime. Jamal could hear the hum of the plane's engines, the creaks of the fuselage as it cut through the sky. His heart raced, but he couldn't let the fear take control. He had to act. The voice on the other end of the radio returned, more measured this time. "All right, son, we're going to help you. What's your name?" Jamal Green." "Okay, Jamal, we're going to walk you through this step by step. First, I need you to check the status of the autopilot. Is it still engaged?" Jamal's hands hovered over the controls, his eyes scanning the glowing buttons and switches in front of him. The autopilot light was still on, but the altimeter was dangerously low and the plane was descending too quickly. "It's engaged, but we're losing altitude fast." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a slight crackle as the air traffic controller responded. "All right, Jamal, here's what we're going to do. We need to regain some altitude. Can you see the yoke in front of you?" Jamal's hands found the yoke, the control stick that would allow him to steer the plane. His palms were sweaty and his fingers trembled as he gripped it. "Yeah, I've got it," Jamal replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good. I need you to gently pull back on the yoke to raise the nose of the aircraft. Don't pull too hard, just enough to get us climbing again. Can you do that?" Jamal took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. His entire body felt tense like a coiled spring ready to snap, but he focused on the controller's voice. Slowly, carefully, he pulled back on the yoke. The plane responded instantly, the nose tilting upward. The altimeter needle began to climb, but it was a slow, nerve-wracking process. The plane shuddered as it fought against the turbulence, and Jamal could feel the weight of every passenger behind him pressing down on his shoulders. They were depending on him. All of them. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. "You're doing great, Jamal," the controller said, his voice steady and calm. "Just keep it steady. We're going to get you through this." Jamal swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the instruments in front of him. The altimeter climbed past 15,000 feet, and the plane began to level off. The worst of the turbulence seemed to have passed, but the tension in the cockpit remained thick enough to cut with a knife. "You've got this, Jamal," the controller continued. "We're going to guide you through the descent and landing. It's going to be tricky, but I know you can do it." Jamal's hands were still shaking, but a strange sense of calm began to settle over him. He had stabilized the plane, and though the fear still gnawed at the edges of his mind, it was being replaced by determination. He couldn't fail. Not now. "Okay," Jamal said, his voice stronger this time. "I'm ready." The world outside the cockpit windows was a blur of clouds and sunlight, but all Jamal could focus on were the glowing dials and flashing alarms in front of him. His fingers tightened around the yoke as he pulled the nose of the plane higher, following the air traffic controller's instructions. He could feel the weight of responsibility bearing down on him, but something else began to stir within him. A sense of clarity. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness, but it was muted by an overwhelming determination. "All right, Jamal." The controller's voice crackled through the headset, steady and calm like an anchor in the storm. "You've done a great job stabilizing the plane, but now we're going to focus on bringing it down safely. You're at 25,000 feet right now. We're going to start preparing for your descent into LaGuardia. Can you confirm your airspeed?" Jamal scanned the instrument panel, finding the airspeed indicator. His heart skipped a beat as he saw the needle hovering just below 300 knots. Too fast for a safe descent. "It's around 290 knots, he replied, his voice strained but steady. Good, we're going to need to reduce that before you start your approach. I want you to slowly pull back on the throttle. Can you see the two levers on your right? Jamal's hands shook as he reached for the throttle levers, gripping them tightly. He hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. What if he pulled back too hard? What if he slowed the plane down too much? But there was no time for second guessing. He had to trust himself. Yeah, I see them, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Good. Gently pull them back until you see your airspeed start to drop. We're aiming for around 240 knots. Jamal swallowed hard, his palms sweaty as he pulled back on the throttles. The engines roared in response, and he felt the plane begin to decelerate, the airspeed needle creeping down. His hands trembled, but he kept his focus on the instruments, willing the plane to obey his commands. 240 knots, Jamal reported, his heart still pounding in his chest. Perfect. Now I want you to hold that speed. We're going to start your descent into LaGuardia, but you're going to need to lower the flaps to help slow the plane down even more. Do you see the flap lever? Jamal nodded, though he knew the controller couldn't see him. His eyes darted across the panel until they found the flap lever positioned near his left hand. He had done this 1,000 times in simulators, but never with real lives hanging in the balance. I've got it, he said, gripping the lever. Good. I want you to lower them to the 15 degrees position. Do it slowly. Too fast, and the plane could become unstable. Jamal's breath caught in his throat as he carefully adjusted the flaps. He could feel the change in the plane's handling immediately, the resistance in the yoke increasing as the wings altered their shape. The nose dipped slightly, but Jamal corrected it with a slight pullback on the yoke. The controller's voice was calm, but Jamal could hear the urgency creeping in. All right, Jamal, we're going to get you lined up for your final approach. I need you to turn the plane toward the northeast. Do you see the heading indicator? Jamal's eyes flicked to the heading indicator, a compass-like instrument on the panel in front of him. The plane was still flying west, away from LaGuardia. His pulse quickened. He needed to turn the plane around fast. I see it, he replied, his voice steadying. Good. I need you to gently turn the yoke to the right until you're on a heading of 040. That will point you toward LaGuardia. Jamal took a deep breath, his hands gripping the yoke tightly as he turned it to the right. The plane responded slowly, banking in the direction of the turn. The world outside the cockpit window shifted, the horizon tilting as the aircraft changed course. Jamal's heart raced, but he kept his movements controlled, remembering everything he had learned from his countless hours in front of the simulator. The passengers in the cabin were still silent, their fear palpable in the tension that hung over them like a heavy fog. Some clutched their seats, eyes wide with terror, while others whispered quiet prayers, their voices trembling. Jamal's mother sat frozen, her hands gripping the armrest so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She had never been more afraid in her life. But deep down, a part of her knew that if anyone could do this, it was her son. She had always known he was special, but this was beyond anything she had ever imagined. As the plane leveled off on its new course, Jamal felt a flicker of hope. LaGuardia was getting closer, and he was beginning to feel like he had some control over the situation. But the hardest part was still to come, the landing. Jamal, you're doing an amazing job, the controller said, his voice filled with encouragement. We're almost there. I need you to start preparing for the landing. Do you see the runway ahead? Jamal squinted through the cockpit window, searching the horizon for the familiar sight of a runway. His heart leapt when he finally spotted it. A long strip of concrete jutting out into the water, surrounded by the sprawling city of New York. It looked impossibly small from where he was, but he knew that in just a few minutes, it would be the only thing that mattered. I see it, he said, his voice tight with concentration. Great. Now I need you to lower the landing gear and extend the flaps to 30 degrees. This will slow you down and prepare you for touchdown. Jamal's hands moved almost automatically, his fingers finding the landing gear lever and pulling it down. He heard the satisfying clunk as the landing gear deployed, followed by the familiar whine of the flaps as they extended. The plane shuddered slightly, but Jamal held it steady. Landing gear down, flaps at 30 degrees, he reported, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. Excellent work, Jamal. Now I need you to keep the plane lined up with the runway. You're going to make a gentle descent, keeping your airspeed between 140 and 160 knots. Just focus on keeping the nose of the plane steady and aim for the center of the runway. Jamal's hands were slick with sweat as he gripped the yoke, his knuckles white with the effort. The runway loomed larger with every passing second, and the realization of what he was about to do began to hit him like a tidal wave. He was about to land a real plane, something he had only ever done in simulations. The air traffic controller's voice remained calm, guiding him through every step. "You're doing great, Jamal. You've got this. Just keep her steady." The runway rushed up to meet them, growing larger and larger in the windshield. Jamal could feel the plane resisting his control, the turbulence from the descent making it difficult to maintain a smooth approach. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the ground closed in beneath them. "Almost there," the controller urged. "Keep her steady." At the last possible moment, Jamal pulled back gently on the yoke, flaring the nose of the plane to prepare for touchdown. The wheels hit the runway with a bone-jarring thud, bouncing once before settling onto the tarmac. The tires screeched as they made contact, the aircraft jolting forward with a sudden force. Jamal's hands flew to the reverse thrusters, engaging them as the plane barreled down the runway. The engines roared in protest, but the plane began to slow, the end of the runway rushing toward them at an alarming speed. For a moment, it felt like they weren't going to stop in time. Jamal could hear the gasps of the passengers behind him, their fear tangible in the air. But then, inch by inch, the plane began to decelerate, the end of the runway getting closer but no longer a looming threat. And then, finally, the plane came to a complete stop. There was a moment of absolute silence, as if the entire world had paused to take a breath. And then, like a floodgate bursting open, the cabin erupted into cheers and applause. Tears streamed down passengers' faces as they hugged one another, their relief overwhelming. The flight attendants, who had been holding their breath, collapsed into each other's arms. Overcome with emotion, Jamal sat frozen in the co-pilot's seat, his hands still gripping the yoke so tightly that his fingers ached. His heart hammered in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins like fire. He could barely comprehend what had just happened. The world outside the cockpit window was still, the plane motionless on the runway. But in his mind, everything was spinning. The enormity of what he had just done hadn't yet sunk in. Behind him, the cheers and applause from the cabin washed over him like a distant echo. He heard passengers crying, some laughing in disbelief, but it all felt far away, as if happening in another reality. For a brief moment, he felt completely detached from the chaos, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl. The flight attendant, who had been standing beside him in the cockpit the entire time, was the first to break the silence. She let out a shaky breath, her hand flying to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. You did it, Jamal," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You saved us." But Jamal didn't feel like a hero. He was just a kid who had been thrown into a situation far beyond anything he could have imagined. He looked down at his trembling hands, still gripping the yoke, and wondered how on earth he had managed to do it. The weight of the situation, the lives that had been in his hands, was beginning to settle on him, and it felt crushing. Then suddenly he felt a pair of arms wrap around him. His mother, Danielle, had rushed into the cockpit as soon as the plane had come to a stop. Her face streaked with tears, she pulled him into a tight embrace, her sobs muffled as she buried her face in his hair. "Oh, Jamal," she cried, her voice shaking, "I'm so proud of you. So proud." Jamal closed his eyes, leaning into his mother's embrace. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving him exhausted, his body heavy with the toll of what he had just endured. He didn't have the energy to respond. He just let the moment wash over him, letting his mother's arms anchor him to reality. Behind them, the flight attendants were working to organize the passengers for disembarkation, but the relief in the cabin was palpable. Strangers who had been gripped by fear just moments before were now hugging each other, sharing their relief and joy at having survived. Jamal could hear snippets of conversation as passengers marveled at what had happened. "I can't believe it. A kid landed the plane. He's a hero. That boy saved our lives. He's just a child, but he did it." As the first responders rushed onto the plane, medical personnel immediately headed for the cockpit, checking on the unconscious pilots. Jamal stepped back as the professionals took over, his body still trembling from the shock of it all. He heard one of the paramedics confirm that the pilots were alive but unresponsive. It didn't matter anymore. The plane was on the ground, and they were safe. Jamal's mind was in a fog as he was guided off the plane, his legs unsteady as he walked down the narrow aisle. Passengers reached out to pat him on the back, some offering words of thanks, others simply looking at him with awe. His mother never let go of his hand, her grip tight as if she was afraid to lose him. As they stepped out onto the tarmac, Jamal was blinded by the sudden flash of cameras. A crowd had gathered near the terminal. Reporters, photographers, and onlookers, all jostling for a glimpse of the boy who had just performed a miracle. The news of what had happened aboard SkyWest Flight 728 had spread like wildfire, and the world was eager to meet the boy who had saved a plane full of people. Jamal's mother shielded him from the crowd, but the reporters were relentless. "Jamal, how did you do it?" they shouted. "How did you know how to fly the plane? What was going through your mind?" Jamal didn't know how to answer. His mind was still spinning, his thoughts a jumble of fear, relief, and disbelief. He didn't want the attention. He didn't want to be in the spotlight. All he wanted was to go home, to curl up in his bed and forget about the most terrifying day of his life. But as they made their way through the sea of reporters, something else began to stir in Jamal's chest. Something that felt a lot like pride. He had done it. He had saved them all. And while the attention made him uncomfortable, he couldn't deny that what he had accomplished was extraordinary. As they walked into the terminal, surrounded by cheers and applause, Jamal couldn't help but glance back at the plane. It looked so much smaller now, sitting still and silent on the runway. For years, Jamal had dreamed of flying, of being in control of one of those incredible machines. But he had never imagined it would happen like this. In the days that followed, Jamal's life changed in ways he could never have predicted. The story of SkyWest Flight 728 and the 13-year-old boy who had saved it dominated the news for weeks. Offers for interviews, television appearances, and even book deals flooded in. Reporters camped outside their apartment building, eager for a glimpse of the young hero. Schools reached out, asking if Jamal could come and speak to their students about what he had done. But Jamal, true to his nature, shied away from the attention. He didn't want to be famous. He didn't want to be known as the boy who saved the plane. All he wanted was to return to his normal life, though deep down, he knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. Despite his reluctance to embrace the spotlight, the incident had ignited something inside of Jamal. He had always loved planes, but now that love had transformed into something much deeper, a calling. He spent hours at the library devouring every book on aviation he could find. He watched documentaries, attended local aviation seminars, and saved every penny he could, from his part-time job to one-day pay for flying lessons. The airline, grateful for his bravery, offered Jamal and his mother a lifetime of free flights. But for Jamal, the real reward was the realization that he had found his true passion. The sky was no longer just a dream for him. It was where he belonged. He knew without a doubt that he would one day become a pilot. Not just a boy playing with flight simulators, but a real licensed pilot ready to soar into the skies and explore the world. And as for SkyWest Flight 728, the story became the stuff of legend. People marveled at the courage and composure of a 13-year-old boy who had stepped up when no one else could. Jamal's name became synonymous with heroism. Though to those who knew him best, he remained the same quiet, thoughtful kid who loved nothing more than the world of aviation. In the years to come, Jamal's life would take him to places he had only ever dreamed of, flying over mountains, oceans, and cities that stretched beyond the horizon. The boy who had saved a plane became the man who dedicated his life to flying, his eyes always turned toward the sky, dreaming of new adventures and challenges. For Jamal Green, the sky was no longer the limit, it was just the beginning.